What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Thermo Diet Podcast. My name's Christopher Walker, and I'm here with Jeremiah Mailer.
How's it going? Good morning.
Today, we're going to be talking about how to increase your metabolism in general, just as a topic, whatever our thoughts are on it, and hopefully get some good takeaways from that. Because a lot of people have a slow metabolism.
Definitely.
So I think maybe one way to start is like how to think about the metabolism, because it's kind of this abstract concept that people throw around quite a bit. Really what it is it's energy metabolism. So it's really the measure of the flow of energy through the body, right?
So like the definition is basically all chemical processes that take place within the organism.
Yeah. And the energy required to do so and allow that flow. And it's regulated chiefly by the thyroid gland. So when your thyroid is out of balance, your metabolism ends up being kind of effed. So that's one way to think about like body systems and how to solve body system issues naturally, is to think about what are the glands and what are the chief leverage points essentially for that system that you can optimize, you can focus on. In this case, focusing on your thyroid is a pretty good one. Because it really is that high leverage type of thing. Like you got to make sure the gland is working properly. That's how I thought about all my hormonal issues, like my testosterone issues back in the day was like, what's the chief gland or organ that's gonna have to be optimized in order to make this happen properly, naturally. It was the pituitary, and making sure the signaling from the hypothalamus to pituitary to gonadal glands and adrenal glands is working properly, right? So in this case, we're looking at the thyroid, which also has feedback. Don't get it wrong. It has feedback to all these other organs as well. But if you're just focused on this thyroid gland, you're going to get most bang for your buck, because the feedback will naturally be good to the other glands.
Yeah. So do we want to define like basically what the axis is?
Sure.
Yeah. So there's the hypothalamus pituitary thyroid axis. And so basically your body's constantly taking feedback from its environment, both externally and internally. And through that feedback, the hypothalamus will tell the pituitary what to do, and the pituitary will tell the thyroid what to do. Yeah.
And then the release of these certain hormones also, has influence throughout the body, which is then fed back via the spinal cord to the brain. So it's a simple way to think about things that, like, I don't think most people think about things in respects to these feedback loops. But it's a good way to do it, because when you start to even just visualize, like, here's how it's going to work, it just makes more sense. It's less nebulous. It's less abstract. Your spinal cord really is this I guess feedback highway back up to your brain, and then the hypothalamus and pituitary are really what are chiefly controlling hormones in the body. Depending on what you're focused on, whether it's reproductive health or metabolism or whatever, it's going to be communicating with different organs through different signaling molecules, signaling hormones. But it's pretty cool. And then if you think about like Jayton saying, the environmental feedback, that comes through different avenues as well. That's then fed back through up the spinal cord to the brain. So you have your gut, you have your skin, certain things like that. So the gut is obviously where you're going to be eating your food. Goes in, travels down, needs to be digested. The micronutrients are pulled out of the food, processed. They trigger signaling cascades, and that cascade feeds back to the brain and so forth. So you want to, that kind of highlights, I guess, how important it is to have a good gut health in general, and why so many things can go wrong for somebody if they have a messed up gut, because that feedback gets dysregulated, essentially.
Right. And it works both ways. So like if you have a low metabolism, you're going to be producing less stomach acid, less enzymes, and you're not going to be getting as many micronutrients and stuff from your food. So that's why the Thermo Diet is so unique, because it's all very easily digestible food.
Yep.
That's going to be very easily taken up by the body, and it's going to be able to fuel all of these processes that are happening.
Yeah, that's one thing with these feedback loops that's really interesting is that there's like some sort of concept of momentum in them, like a reinforcement of the feedback over time. So it gets better and better and better and better, or it gets worse and worse and worse and worse over time. So as long as you start to get that momentum going in the right direction and building your habits around, consuming the right foods, regulating your stress properly, having good gut health, so forth, it ends up reinforcing itself, and it gets better and better and better until it, really approaches that optimal stage. But on the other end, people have all these bad habits for the most part, if you look at just the general population, and they're constantly reinforcing it in the negative way. So they're reinforcing bad gut health, they're reinforcing micronutrient deficiencies, they're reinforcing consumption of polyunsaturated fats, toxic oils, bad environmental stressors, skin agents that are endocrine disrupting. That's why it's really important to take a holistic view of this whole thing and look at like your entire lifestyle and how this all is going to work, because you are constantly either reinforcing these feedback loops toward good health or away from it with every sort of action that you take. And you want the net accumulative load, I guess, to be positive, and moving in that direction constantly, right?
It's both physiological and psychological. So, the psychology plays just as an important role as the physiological role, because whenever you have these negative thought patterns, you're going to increase the amount of cortisol, the amount of adrenaline that's being secreted into the system. Then that's going to be extremely catabolic and start to degrade all of these tissues. What's interesting is that they actually have an affinity or a liking for a lot of the more sensitive endocrine glands too. So they'll start breaking down a lot of those for amino acids, which is kind of interesting.
Because organs are a rich source of all sorts of good nutrients, essentially, that the body wants.
Yeah.
So if you start to lack them in other areas, that's what's going to be attacked, really, if it catabolized. When you're in that chronic cortisol state. Yeah, people underestimate the power of their own mind, whether it could be damaging them or building them up. But yeah, the stress regulation really is a massive component to it. If you just looked at like the leverage curve in general and certain things that you shouldn't be doing, one of them is really just having like a high stress lifestyle in general that you can't regulate or control, modulate, whatever. That'd be a big one. I'd say like the two biggest ones, if you had like nothing else you're going to focus on that you wanted the biggest leverage, would be stress regulation psychologically, and then on the physiological side, just not consuming PUFAs.
Yeah,
those are like the two big things.
Definitely.
Yeah, that'd be good. So let's talk about the thyroid. Let's talk about metabolism. We can think about, like, if you think back to the Master Your Tea book. I know probably a lot of people listening to this have read Master Your Tea. It's my book on testosterone enhancement. That was really the first time that we had considered like a framework for thinking about health issues, and like taking a health issue and then having some step-by-step way of like a thought process in order to solve that. So in that book, and this could be how we think about thyroid or metabolism right now, is the pyramid. So at the base of the pyramid, you have micronutrients, then you move up, you go to nutrition aspects, you go to lifestyle aspects, then certain exercise and like anabolic nature versus catabolic nature, and then supplements that you could use, and these are all also relative symbolically to like the amount of leverage that they have on the system. So the most important thing is the micronutrients. So let's start there.
So what are some of the most important micronutrients that you would say are necessary for optimal metabolism?
Iodine, selenium, copper, zinc, magnesium.
Magnesium's a big one.
Yeah.
And I see sodium,
all the electrolytes essentially, which is insane, like how common electrolyte deficiencies are when it's something that's so widely known. Like I remember I knew about electrolytes when I was a little kid, because of Gatorade, I think was why. Because of Gatorade's commercials and stuff, they're like electrolyte, But Gatorade doesn't even have that many electrolytes in it. But that was like a widely known thing. So as I got older and realized like how common the deficiency is of electrolytes, it's almost mind blowing because everyone knows about electrolytes.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like this thing that's uncommon to be aware of, right?
Yeah.
But they're so widely used in the body.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the deficiency is very common for all of them, pretty much.
Yeah. And like salt, so many people think that you're supposed to restrict salt whenever it's the most abundant electrolyte inside of the body and makes up most of the extracellular fluid.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually necessary for like nerve impulses to take place. So you can't actually contract your muscles without having enough sodium to cross the cellular membrane to trigger an action potential. And so
yeah,
all these people that are restricting salt are kind of restricting their nervous system in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. That like in all my neuroscience classes in college, like when you study neuroscience even just a little bit, even on like a surface level, if you open up a book, textbook on it, you see it immediately. You're like, everything is controlled by different electrolytes in your nervous system, in your brain. They are really what which you can find as a root of the word electrolyte, but they trigger the electrical impulses in the brain in general. All that communication, it's all based electrically or electrochemically on the concentrations of different electrolytes, because they're going to be what are like opening and closing these ion channels, these gated basically pathways of communication in the body. They're going to be triggering the action potential, like Jayton said, which an action potential is literally like an electrical impulse through the neuronal communication, essentially, just throughout all these cells. And if you don't have basically an action potential is interesting because you have to hit a threshold with the ionic concentration. Like these salts are essentially acting like, how would you explain ions in a simple way? Like it's this, it's charges, literally, that
just positive and negative charges.
Yeah. So if the charge isn't going to reach this threshold, it never triggers the action potential, right? So it has to hit a threshold first, and then it shoots off that impulse. And if you look at the, like, I guess it'd be like some sort of electrical impulse chart. If you look at an action potential on it, there's really this slow rise when there's this ionic concentration before it hits that threshold, and then it triggers this massive, shoot straight up, and then it goes down, and there's a refractory period where it goes under what it initially was at, and then it goes back to baseline, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's how your nervous system communicates so quickly, just imperceptibly fast in all these things. And like Jayton mentioned, if you don't have the right amount of these different electrolytes, and especially salt is a huge part of the human diet that needs to be there, then it's going to have your nervous system going to have trouble constantly reaching the concentrations that it needs to trigger the action potentials in the right way. And it's really all about like the cumulative effect. This is something that takes, if you're deficient, a lot of people are deficient even when they're kids. I mean, there's plenty of research showing that people are massively deficient in certain things when they're born because of the mother being deficient in those things. And then it leads over decades into these issues. And for some people, the issues could show up immediately as a child. For other people, it takes until they're older, maybe 50s and 60s, to start having issues, especially in the nervous system. But then you can really have like extremely serious problems, nervous system issues, from MS to Alzheimer's and so forth as you age. And a lot of them can be traced completely back to just like cumulative deficiency over decades. That's why it's so massively important, and why it's so like insane that nobody focuses on this stuff, because it's so foundationally simple as well, and it's simple to correct.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing. Like I guess the first thing is just in general the electrolytes.
Yeah. So sodium and potassium are the main ones that are used for the actual action potential. And then like whenever you're going across the synaptic cleft, you have calcium.
And potassium there's all these channels that are gated by certain concentrations of these salts or these electrolytes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so calcium is actually interesting because a lot of people are worried about calcium deposits, but they actually have it backwards. So it's the lack of calcium in the diet that leads to calcium deposits, because what happens is the parathyroid hormone is elevated in the body, which creates secretion of calcium or leaching of calcium from the bones. And then that calcium from the bones is deposited into the blood, and then it's carried around the body that way, and then it gets deposited whenever it's traveling through the body. Whereas if you were to supply your body with enough calcium, which is usually around 2,500 milligrams a day for an average sized person, then you're going to lower the amount of parathyroid hormone that's in the system and allow your body to be able to use that calcium efficiently for things like, proper bone growth, teeth, stuff like that.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good highlight of just like a way to think about the law of compensation within the body itself. Like, so if you're not supplying, calcium is a really easy one to think about because there are so many issues with calcium, like stones, like kidney stones, osteoporosis in general. As people age, these become really common in the general population, and it's really due to the fact that if you're not supplying your body with an outside source of the right amount of these things, over time, as you get deficient, your body's going to find it's going to find a way to get the stuff it needs. Because if you look at like a hierarchy of importance in the body, it's naturally always going to protect the nervous system and just key vital functions. And the bones, muscles, those sorts of things are lower on the priority list. So it starts to catabolize and leach minerals that it needs from other areas of the body. That's what leads to these other issues later in life, because you've actively been pulling calcium from your bones and so forth, because you're not supplying your body with enough of it. And that goes really with anything, amino acids as well. Like, your body needs all these amino acids to operate properly, and if it's not getting them from the diet, then it'll start pulling them from other places. And that's also where people start to with a lot of the anti-stress amino acids or protective amino acids that are found in connective tissue, that like your joints and that sort of thing. If you're not consuming those amino acids in your diet, your body's going to start pulling them from other places that it needs it. And that's when people start to lead to, they get arthritis issues later and so forth. Your body's literally like pulling those important things from the connective tissue, from the joints, and it needs it.
Yeah. And it's also like whenever you're glucose deficient, the body will start pulling amino acids from the muscle and different endocrine glands to convert those amino acids via gluconeogenesis into glucose.
That's one reason why the keto diet's kind of dumb.
Yeah.
You're actively like allowing your body to do that. You're choosing to let it do that. But luckily, most people don't even have the ability to stay on the keto diet for very long.
Yeah, because they start feeling like crap.
Yeah, no wonder. So we're talking. So the first thing for metabolism, how to increase your metabolism, make sure the electrolytes are topped up, because just in general, you need them. All that neuronal communication is extremely important. All this stuff is tied together. I think a lot of people think like, oh, your brain isn't your metabolism. Like they just have this compartmentalized view, because a lot of Western medicine in general has that, for some reason, has that view of like all these compartmentalized things. Like, oh, because something's if you look at, like, if you talk to a heart doctor or cardiovascular surgeon or something, ask him a question, they're going to only see the lens. They're going to see the body through that lens, right? Because that's all they studied. You talk to a brain surgeon, he's going to only see it through that lens. You talk to a podiatrist, he's only going to see it through that lens.
It's a very reductionistic view.
Yeah, it's wild to me that pervades. Like, it's not logical at all how something, and a lot of people, even very smart people like doctors, researchers, just don't see the whole system of the body like they don't see it as a system, which is wild. They only see these like kind of myopic views of different parts of the body.
They view it almost like a machine instead of like an actual organism that's self-healing and actually has the ability to communicate with itself, instead of looking at it like a robot where I just need to fix this,
Yeah. Well, even machines, though, like, they are just these massive systems. This gets into also just like all this I love this type of stuff, but like philosophy of the mind and that sort of thing. Because I remember back in college in one of our neuroscience courses, we had to do, we actually looked a lot, really common studies in neuroscience are around like behavioral neuroscience. And AI is a huge focus right now in academic neuroscience, and like, therefore consciousness comes up, and that just made me think of like the old Rene Descartes. He had his genius, like brilliant concept back then that really just like messed up, just threw the whole world of philosophy on its head for a minute until it got kind of recalibrated and people reconsidered what he was doing. But he made this garden of automatons, essentially, where it was like unbelievable. I think it's still amazing what he did, but he took water and he was using like a hydro-powered garden of these robots that they were like the first robots, from what I understand, where they were really just these machines, and he was allowing the flow of water through the machine to animate the machine. And that really like messed up people's minds, because they were watching these things back then. I think it was like in Victorian times or something. I can't remember the year. Was it 1500, 1600, somewhere back then. And he had this little garden, and all these like fancy Victorian people were looking at it and like, what the hell's going on? Like these robots he was pumping water through all of them, and they were acting like people. And like for people to see this, I think even now, if you really consider it, it's kind of troubling. You're like, how it's just this force, this water force, like a hydro, like a flow of water, which is interesting, because if you think about like the way that we think about the body now, with the flow of energy through the system, is what animates and creates order within it. And that back then he was proving that you could do it with water, and you could make these like robots that were animated and they were moving, and people were it was messing up their heads, because they were like, how is this? I thought we were so special and unique, and like he's like, I can make this thing talk, and like just by pumping water through it in the right way, and its limbs are moving and it's picking things up or whatever. And that even back then proved that like it's just this one big system that you can animate with the flow of some sort of energy through it. Back then it was hydro powered, essentially.
Yeah. Thinking of consciousness, like it's really interesting to relate the consciousness to the metabolism, because basically you can kind of relate your perception of reality to how high your metabolism is and how well it's functioning. Because there's some people that have stated that whenever babies are born, so like for the first 2 years of your life, your metabolism is so high that you're practically in a psychedelic state of consciousness. That's why so many people don't really remember their first 2 years of their life.
I wish I could go back to just being constantly high, like just a little baby. You're soaking everything in. You're so creative.
Their metabolism's so high that they're just constantly in that state of consciousness. So, and then we don't have the ability to tap back into that, so we don't remember that time in our life.
And that's when you really learn everything. And and that was something in the Thermo Diet in the course and everything, talking about the idea of thermo being like the perfect state of health, where as a concept that you want to move back toward, right? And back, like as a child, you are in your situation, you're the most healthy as a child that you'll ever be in your life, and you start to move away from it. So thermo conceptually is the idea of like going back toward that. You'll have the highest metabolism then, your skin's amazing, your creativity, your brain, everything is like as good as it will ever be in your life, barring some sort of like developmental issues or prenatal issues, which are also very common. Like one thing, like government-wide, these big government agencies actually have worldwide large-scale studies on prenatal thyroid issues being one, and micronutrient deficiencies. The more you look into this stuff, the more wild it is that people know about it, but no one talks about it in terms of government bodies and that sort of thing. World Health Organization. And that's why also like these, getting into conspiracy, like weird shit. You're like, these people know about this stuff and they're still like telling you to do all these other things. So that's wild. Like I don't even get that. That's a topic for another time.
Yeah, I know. But it's just like the antidepressant myth. Like people think that serotonin is the happy hormone, whenever it's probably the last thing that you want to be elevating.
Yeah.
And that you want to be keeping in the synaptic cleft. It's really interesting, and they've actually correlated a lot of excessive serotonin production to children being born with autism.
Yeah, autism is interesting. There's a lot of different things that can happen that developmentally that can lead to certain symptoms like that. Even like it might even be confused for it, but like mitochondrial issues, developmental mitochondrial issues can lead to certain just symptoms that are very similar to autism, which is interesting. And it's extremely common, especially in developing nations, to have, and in the U.S. even now, but more so in other countries, have the mother having thyroid issues with while she's pregnant can lead to developmental issues and obviously deficiencies and obviously hypothyroidism in the child from birth. So it's extremely important, especially for mothers, to make sure that they're not suffering from these sorts of issues while they're pregnant. Yeah, and you can bet, like when I eventually have kids, like I'm gonna make sure my wife is like healthy.
Oh yeah.
I'll be like, all right, we're getting you tested all the time, like keeping you topped up. Get those umzu minerals and vitamins in there, and eating that collagen.
And like a lot of women try to start eating quote unquote healthy whenever they get pregnant, but they're very undernourished and they're not eating the right types of food, which leads to even more problems developing over time.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the trace minerals, right? So we talked about minerals in general, like electrolytes. Trace minerals that are really important for the thyroid gland and your metabolism in general are the copper, iodine, and selenium.
And zinc.
Yeah. I don't know if would you classify that as a trace mineral or not?
I would. Yeah.
Okay.
I guess it can also be like a heavy metal too, in some cases.
Yeah. These things are all like kind of different. You can classify them as different things, I guess. Except for vitamins, they're just vitamins.
Yeah. And then, so I think if we're going to talk about the trace minerals, we also need to talk about certain amino acids like tyrosine. So tyrosine is actually what makes up the middle of the iodine molecule. And then, the difference between T4 and T3. So T4 has a tyrosine molecule with 4 iodine molecules attached to it. And then what happens so the thyroid mainly produces T4. And so T4 is then carried to the peripheral tissues or the liver to be converted to T3 via the deiodinase enzyme. And so this enzyme cleaves off one of the iodine molecules to allow it to be T3. And then whenever it gets inside the cell, it can start to take action. And so T3 is the more active thyroid hormone, whereas T4 is more of the inactive thyroid hormone that's mainly just carried around the body.
Which is why you want to be able to convert it. And a good way to think about that is like just even the name T4, T3, right? T, tyrosine, 4 iodines.
Yeah.
T, tyrosine, 3 iodines.
Yeah, like
so, simple, right?
T3 triiodothyronine. That's what it is. Yeah.
So it's pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think a lot of people know that.
But unfortunately, a lot of doctors, what they do is whenever you complain of hypothyroid-like symptoms, they'll give you a TSH test, and your TSH will be low, and then your T4 will be normal. However, and so they'll just send you home with you still suffering from all of these symptoms. And what happens is you actually don't have the ability to convert the T4 into the T3, and so you actually are at the cellular level hypothyroidism, like you have hypothyroidism, but the doctors via the poor blood tests that they're using,
focusing on the wrong markers.
They're not measuring the right things, and so
and TSH, so people know, is thyroid stimulating hormone.
Yes, from the pituitary.
Yeah.
So you usually want to keep that around like 0.7 to 0.8 or lower, and then anything above that is relatively hypothyroid-like.
So and this also highlights how important your liver health really is. even with all of this stuff is like liver is freaking massively important for even like all the reproductive health stuff, because it releases SHBG, which if your liver is like overworked, what it ends up doing is releasing a lot of SHBG, and that's why people, even with something as small as Tylenol, they've found that Tylenol can trigger a massive release of SHBG into the blood, which is what goes and binds all your reproductive hormone, your androgens in the blood. So it makes them so they can't bind to anything else. So you got to pay attention to your liver. It's especially as you get older and older and older, the liver is like constantly working, and it not only is critical in your reproductive health, but it's critical in your thyroid and your metabolism in general.
And then another important thing about T3 is that it's actually necessary for steroid synthesis. And so pretty much any kind of hormone synthesis, especially like pregnenolone, progesterone, DHEA, and then further down the line, testosterone, DHT, it's necessary for all of these processes to take place. And so if you don't have enough T4 being converted into T3, you're not going to be able to make enough steroid hormones. And so a lot of the times men who have low T end up jumping on hormone replacement therapy whenever they are actually just hypothyroid and they need to focus on their thyroid health. And then whenever they get their thyroid functioning correctly, their steroidogenesis will ramp up.
Yeah. I don't know why don't doctors know? Why aren't they even taught this? I know they're not taught very much nutrition, like really low amount of nutrition.
I think it's like 4 hours in the entire 8 years that they're in school.
Yeah, and we talked about that on another episode, like kind of how that is fed back into their disbelief in nutrition based on like the poor quality of nutrition training, like the material they don't believe is even that good, therefore they just write it off. But then on this stuff, like hormones in general, even endocrinologists, I don't like, but in my experience with endocrinologists, and I've seen quite a few of them over the years when I was having my issues, like they don't even focus on these cascades of hormones. It's crazy. And endocrinologists, I would consider to be some of the most intelligent doctors in general, like MDs. Their training is extremely rigorous and difficult, and I mean the endocrine system is extremely difficult to understand and nuanced, yet they don't think in a system mindset like this. Like they're still going to say, like, if the tests that they order are indicative, I think, of how they think about it, and they are not ordering for a guy that walks in to an endocrinologist with low T, they're not ordering a full panel like this to get the full view. They're not looking at the thyroid at all. They're just looking for usually LH levels and FSH. If you're lucky, I mean, a lot of them will just order like a total testosterone, and they're not even looking at the LH or FSH
or free T
or estrogen or cortisol. Like I get a lot of people sending me tests, which is great. Like send me your tests, but I don't always have time to look at them or kind of see what people are doing. But
yeah, I love looking at blood work too. I don't know.
I like it. It's like this big puzzle. But a lot of the tests that I get sent are just like terribly ordered. They don't show much of a view, so I would end up sending back feedback to that person, like, hey man, did you check this? Did your doctor check these other things? Because that's really what's going to tell you the whole story about like really what you need to be focused on here. And every single time they're like, no, my doctor just ordered this. So it's an issue. That's why eventually I really want to figure out, how to integrate really solid testing into the UMZU business model. It's financially expensive to do. So there's a little bit of financial innovation that we're going to have to figure out, like value innovation, how to be able to do this properly. But if we can get testing to the point where it's commercially viable to have full panels done on yourself and have like almost just these, based on your results, here's a to-do list. If we can figure that out, that'd be incredible for personalized medicine and empowering like the individual on how to deal with this stuff properly, because the medical system currently is just not doing it right.
Yeah, and like a lot of the times the doctors won't even allow you to request the type of blood work that you want done.
Yeah.
It's like we don't have a right to our, like, what's going on with us biologically.
Exactly. And that comes down to ultimately, I think everyone wants to know, even on like, if you have like a different level of understanding, like some people understand a lot, some people understand very little, but ultimately every single person does want to know their own data, right, about their body. And that's fundamentally, I think you're right to know it. Right now we're currently, just based on like the time we live in and how this is all set up, it's hard to do. Financially, it's difficult. I think a lot of the testing stuff with doctors, like I think they're completely told how, like what they can and what they cannot order based on insurance, and that's why they end up giving you only limited information and then prescribing some sort of a drug or hormone therapy usually. Which it's just kind of messed up, because they only have a limited view, and if they're being told what they can and can't order by an insurance company, who's then completely controlled by a pharmaceutical company, or a bunch of them, it's kind of messed up. I think there's a big opportunity for us to innovate throughout our lifetimes and make this system better. So anyway, that's a little diatribe off track, but. Back to some of the trace minerals. So we have iodine, obviously, is extremely important. The tyrosine as an amino acid is extremely important, also for dopamine in the body.
Selenium is extremely important for the conversion of T4 to T3 inside the liver.
Yeah, well, and selenium and iodine deficiencies are widespread, like very, very common, because it's not easy to get either of them in your diet.
Yeah.
And iodine, especially, we can stay on iodine for a second. That's where goitrogens do come into play. Anything that's going to block the uptake of iodine into the thyroid gland is going to harm the T4 production in general. It's going to make it so it naturally, if you think about what T4 is, what Jayton described, tyrosine, 4 iodines. If you don't have the iodine available, it's not going to be there. You can't make that hormone. Therefore, if you're consuming things that are blocking the ability of your thyroid gland to uptake iodine and like bring it into the gland to be able to use and to make this hormone, you're actually harming this whole cascade of events, and therefore it's not that radical to think that a lot of people's problems are because they're consuming things that are goitrogenic.
And phytic acid as well. Phytic acid from grains is a big one too.
Yeah, any sort of anti-nutrient, that's big, because the anti-nutrients they carry a charge that's going to bind a certain mineral. Usually a handful of them are things like calcium, zinc. I think iodine also.
I think most of like the anti-nutrients are a negative charge, and they're attaching to all these positively charged ions.
Yeah, like calcium's like 2+. Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's like a magnet.
Yeah.
Think about it like a magnet. But goitrogens can be kind of controversial. They're very real. They do block, like a goitrogen will block iodine uptake into the thyroid. What comes down to being controversial, I think, in health circles is more about the load, because it takes a lot of consumption of a lot of like a high amount of goitrogens to make that impact perceptible. And this, I was at a dinner the other day with some health guys that were in the space, and one of the guys, he's kind of a little self-righteous, but I was talking about, I wasn't eating a salad at dinner. I'm like, I don't eat lettuce. Like, I'm not into that.
It's nasty.
And yeah, I'm like, why?
It taste good.
Yeah, exactly. But meanwhile, I ate the most epic baked potato I've ever had in my life, which I could tell you about it in a minute. But so I'm not eating salad, and he's like, why aren't you eating salad? Because he's eating a salad, and again, he's gonna get all, he's getting a little. People get a little testy, like if you challenge their beliefs, right? And I'm like,
they attach their identity to that.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is me.
Well, and then they feel like I'm somehow judging him. I don't give two shits if he eats a salad or not. Like,
I don't care.
I really don't care. But he's like projecting that on me, that I'm judging him, and then therefore he gets all defensive, and he's like, why aren't you eating a salad? It's like, I don't eat lettuce. I don't eat any sort of greens. It's just not, like, it's not my thing. And then he keeps prodding into it. I wasn't even bringing up any of the details. And I'm like, I just don't eat goitrogens in general. Like I don't eat beans. I'm in general not concerned with, like I don't find any point in consuming things that are goitrogenic. And he's like, I read all the research and I've seen this, blah, blah, blah. Like goitrogens aren't a thing. Like you got to eat so many pieces of lettuce to make it an impact. I'm like, well, yeah, so I'm just not going to eat any of it. So, you can keep doing your thing. He's like, I read all the research. It's like, yeah, dude, I definitely read way more research than you. Like you're whatever. I'm not even gonna.
But then, like, even if that's the case, you can still bring up the point that the fact that all of this cellulose that you're intaking, we don't produce cellulase.
Yeah.
So we simply cannot
break
digest
down a plant cell
food.
wall.
Yeah.
It's a plant cell wall is made out of cellulose.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people do that. It's common, especially in people that are like somewhat educated on a subject, but then they have that, like, it's almost just the mindset of like, they think you're judging them, therefore they're going to defend yourself. I wasn't judging them at all. I don't really care. So anyway, so goitrogens, though, it is a thing that like the load of goitrogens matters. Unfortunately, like it's not just, goitrogens are in legumes also, and nuts and that sort of thing. So people actually consume way more than they think. Mm-hmm. And so that guy's argument was like, oh, I'd have to eat so much lettuce in order to make this a thing. And I'm like, well, okay, sure. Like, but a lot of people do. There are a lot of people that focus, especially people that are eating very like a higher plant-based diet or that sort of thing. They eat a lot of raw vegetables and a lot of raw leaves and stems. A lot of people like every day are eating raw leaves. They're eating beans. They're eating these things that are goitrogenic, and they end up wondering why they have thyroid problems. I'm just thinking of a case, like I know a woman who has been on thyroid medication for like 30 years or something. She's a vegan, and we were having a discussion about it, and I was like, I think it's the diet. Like your diet is what is causing your thyroid issues. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard for people to accept it, especially when you build an identity around a diet like that. But I think it's just true. So you want to make sure to limit your load of goitrogens that you're consuming. Just naturally, they're gonna harm the iodine uptake into your thyroid gland, and therefore the production of T4, the conversion of T3, and the cascade of events that happens mm-hmm. throughout that whole loop, feedback loop.
And I think another thing is like a lot of these people who are eating a lot of raw, especially raw cruciferous vegetables that are hard to digest, they have like this little pooch belly, like they're not fat. They don't have any fat on them, but they still have like this little pooch.
Yeah.
And what that is all of those vegetables that they're intaking are fermenting in the gut and feeding all of the bacteria that are in there. So all of this bad bacteria is constantly reproducing, and it produces more and more. And then you have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth mm-hmm. that leads to constant bloating. It produces a bunch of gas.
IBS symptoms.
Mm-hmm. Endotoxin, serotonin.
Ulcerative colitis, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's another thing, like the serotonin thing in the gut and the endotoxin. A lot of people don't understand that your gut is just full of neurons. Mm-hmm. And that, how do you think it's communicating with up the spinal cord through to the brain? Like it's communicating with neurons.
90% of serotonin is produced inside of the gut.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't need vegetables. I've said it before, I'll say it again. You just don't. So whatever, make your own choice, but and life is better without them, trust me. Like you'll enjoy what you eat way more if you don't eat vegetables. Vegetables being defined in the thermo sense of like stems and leaves, which is really what they are. Mm-hmm. Focus on fruits and roots.
Yeah, and they're easily digestible too. Like you can
get the nutrients from
mm-hmm.
them.
Like squash and cucumber, those are fruits. They're mm-hmm. really easy to digest. They're pretty delicious.
They're delicious. Thermo foods are just more delicious than other foods. Like you're focused on like the better food. I think someone posted in the group the other day, I thought it was great, like his thermo grocery run. And then he was like all this stuff, like organic sourdough and like all these cool things that he was getting. And he's like, when you realize that thermo is really just living the good life.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, you look at the foods you're eating, you're like, damn, this is freaking great. Like, these are just good foods. They taste better. They're good for me. it's the way to be. And that's what makes Thermo so easy. Once you start doing it, you're like, man, I'm just gonna eat like this because it's great. It's like delicious, you know? And I feel good. Okay, so that's iodine. I think we've probably covered enough about iodine, right?
Yeah.
So let's want to talk about selenium a little bit then?
Yeah, so selenium is necessary, especially in the liver, for the conversion of T4 to T3. So I think that it's involved with the deiodinase enzyme that helps cleave off that iodine molecule. And so if you don't have enough selenium in the system, you're not going to be able to convert enough of the T4 into T3 to be used within the cell. And so if you have a selenium deficiency, especially if like you don't eat very much seafood, so selenium is most densely found in like oysters and
shellfish.
Shellfish. So a lot of people don't eat these on a daily basis, so you're most likely going to be a little bit deficient in selenium.
Yeah. Liver too, obviously. If you want to,
yeah.
Liver. That's why, I mean, this discussion might be helping people understand like why consuming liver actually is so valuable. Like you get so much bang for your buck, because a lot of this is based around both reproductive and metabolic cascades go through the liver. So if you can consume like very healthy livers from animals that aren't all effed up from like hormone therapies and antibiotics and whatever, but like get the good stuff, and if you can consume those regularly, you're going to be making sure that you're just supplying your body with these nutrients that it needs, these trace minerals, these amino acids that it really needs, and that it's kind of hard to find in other sources. I mean, you can get it from eggs too. That's why eggs are such an awesome thing.
Yeah, and B vitamins, it is packed full of all of the B vitamins.
Yeah.
Liver is the most micronutrient dense food on the face of the planet that we're aware of.
I think heart too, right?
Heart is actually really interesting because it's the organ second to the testes that has the most testosterone, which is really interesting.
Give you that heart. It's like I think of the Temple of Doom, just whoosh, you know, yanking it out of that guy. You don't want to do that though. Like don't get all weird on me.
Yeah. But so that's really interesting. And like heart, it's kind of like a stew meat if you've ever had it. So it really doesn't have a taste to it. It just tastes like regular meat, and it's packed full of all kinds of minerals.
Oh, so you got some thymus gland the other day. Did you eat that yet?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, how'd it go?
It's interesting. Yeah,
it's known as sweetbread.
Yeah,
for the texture of it. Right?
So a lot of these people are selling organs at the farmers market here in Boulder, and I'll come up and I'll get like, a couple pounds of liver, a heart, and then I get some sweetbread, and the person that sells them to me just looks at me like I'm a crazy person. But
they're the ones selling it, and they're still like, man, Jayton's insane.
Yeah.
This guy's eating so many organs, it's crazy.
Yeah. But no, it was interesting. It's really chewy. So it tastes like you're just sitting there chewing on rubber, kind of. It doesn't taste bad, but like you got to sit there for like 10 minutes on one bite.
It's more about the texture of certain stuff.
Yeah.
Like,
so that was
interesting. I do like squid and octopus though too. But they have that kind of that rubbery, like chewy, But they're good with certain toppings, like certain dip it in like little jelly or hot pepper jelly.
Yeah. But no, so like whenever you get done eating liver though, you feel like a superhuman almost. Like you just feel good.
Yeah. Well, I think also just with any high dose B vitamin like that, like a bunch of B vitamins, so you can get a wide range of them from a good natural source. Because a lot of B vitamins, it's difficult to get them from natural sources unless you're eating the organ meats like that or good grass-fed steak or something like that. Because a lot of supplemental B vitamins, they're synthetic. That's why you end up peeing out like a lime green, sometimes. They still work. I mean, they're still there, but they're just not as good, obviously, as if you can get it direct from the source.
Yeah. So what's next for?
Well, also copper, Copper is a common deficiency. All these things are common deficiency. If you look at like population studies, everyone's deficient in everything. Choline also, if we want to talk about choline for the liver.
Choline's a big one.
Choline's massive. I think from what I've seen, if it's not the most common micronutrient deficiency, then it's one of the top 2 or 3, choline. But it's extremely necessary for so many things in the body, especially liver health, but also neurotransmitter production of acetylcholine.
Acetylcholine is like the most abundant neurotransmitter in the body, isn't it?
Excitatory. Yeah, it's really, really essential for your hypothalamus and your hippocampus. So acetylcholine in the hippocampus is really interesting. I did a whole semester on this class about the neurobiology of learning and memory, which was fascinating, and that's really what like got me into it. Like, you really start thinking about focus, you start thinking about memory, you start thinking about like this stuff. Almost it leads into perception and stuff too. But you realize how essential choline is, along with the electrolytes, in the proper functioning of like a healthy, just a healthy brain and a healthy experience of the world. Because when you start looking at like focus and memory, learning, that sort of thing, that really is, it brings it out of like just this purely internal biology and like starts to introduce external inputs into your life, and like it makes you think about your perception of the world and how vital it is that these nutrients completely do control your perception of the world, which is wild. Like, if you can't remember anything, if you can't learn very easily and so forth, you're gonna have just your walk through life is like totally different than someone who is all topped up on this stuff and they can create acetylcholine properly to have a good, healthy functioning hippocampus. And there's actually like really interesting studies on even the difference between the male and the female brain. This goes down to shows like the difference in hormones and the impact that hormones are going to have on your hippocampus. And I don't know, like, people might get triggered from this, but this is just biological reality. Men, because of testosterone, because of androgens, in the developing brain, like when in the fetus, really, because of the presence of these androgens that are literally like creating the primary characteristics of a man, while the baby is developing. Actually, the androgen, the ratio being higher in these male reproductive hormones, higher than in women, actually forms the hippocampus in a certain way, so that men are, and it's not completely true across the board. We all know men that aren't great at spatial reasoning and spatial awareness, but it's more of the exception than the rule. The rule in general is these androgens are forming the hippocampus of a male to be able to remember and be more spatially aware of surroundings in the environment. And it's like it creates a richer map. And that's why a lot of women just are not as good at directions, for example. Men are better typically at like spatial awareness because of the presence of the male reproductive hormones in the forming the primary male characteristics of the fetus, as it becomes a baby, a human male. So I thought that was fascinating, and you start to realize really just how important something like choline, something like magnesium, potassium, sodium, and calcium really are to like your entire experience in the world.
Like magnesium, magnesium is there's at least 300 enzymatic reactions that are magnesium dependent.
Yeah, so magnesium is a big one.
Yeah, so they have to have magnesium to go to completion. There's some sources that actually go all the way up to 3,700 magnesium dependent enzymatic reactions in the body. So magnesium is huge.
And talking about enzymes, so we haven't really we mentioned a little bit in terms of like gut health, and that's what most people think about when they think about enzymes. They think about gut, because people obviously are all like, there's a lot more awareness around digestive enzymes, but enzymes in general are really like they act as cofactors, and they act as catalysts in the body in a lot of different ways. So when we talk about cascades of events, cascades are that's kind of like the formal biological term or biochemistry concept of like this sequence of events that happens. So if essentially if something is going to trigger. If you think about feedback loops being like more of like the macro of something, and then you think about these cascades, these like micro cascades, and there's tons of shit that happens. Like we're oversimplifying the explanation of certain things, like which is necessary because most people, I don't know, like nobody even cares about like all this random stuff, and it's hard to keep track of all of it. And for the most part, like scientists are finding new stuff all the time, and they're not even like, they don't even fully know. But the enzymes are so important to every single cascade, and that highlighting back to why magnesium is so damn important, because it's involved in really a lot of like most of these enzymatic reactions in the body. Therefore, if you're deficient in magnesium, those reactions are going to suffer. The cascades are going to in some way have to compensate, do the law of compensation. They'll find what they need, but they end up suffering and cause dysregulation over time if you don't have enough magnesium. But the enzymes are what's going to trigger a lot of these things, and they trigger over and over and over. And like within a single reaction, there's going to be a lot of them involved. So if you're deficient in magnesium, then you should realize that these enzymatic cofactors and catalysts are essentially not going to function as well as they should. If that happens over chronic periods of time, it starts to just suffer. The system suffers in general. So just to highlight how important that is.
Yeah, definitely. But so what else we got?
Well, there's taurine. It's an interesting one. There's what else for metabolism? Why don't we could talk about just some foods that people, I don't know, we're like maybe a little complicated here for people.
Maybe we need to get a little actionable on this.
Yeah. Let's move up. So we're in we talk about micronutrients on that level of pyramid. Next up is nutrition, being like, what should you eat to increase your metabolism, right? Probably the most pure level of this would be something of like a Ray Peat-esque diet, right? Focusing on those sorts of things. The issue that I always have is like a pure peat diet is probably fine for
extremists.
Yeah, well, for a short period of time.
Yeah,
it's really difficult to do that.
It is.
Like fresh squeezed orange juice all the time,
milk.
Raw milk, shellfish, whatever. It's not the most satisfying diet, but if you looked at just the breakdown of, and I know where he got this diet from too. If you look at just the breakdown of the minerals and the vitamins and the amino acids that are in it, it's brilliant. I mean, it's like these are the raw, like the things you need to focus on.
And the amount of calories that you can intake whenever you're doing it is absolutely insane. Which
highlights really the idea of the laws of thermodynamics applied to the human system, the biological system, being like that you can, by increasing your metabolism in the body, the energy flow, you can intake more energy, and it'll, you won't gain fat really, because you start to, your metabolism internally is actually matching the increased amount of energy that's coming into the body.
Yeah, I was doing it for like a month, and I was eating like 4,000 calories a day, easy, and didn't gain a pound at all, which is really interesting.
But that's because your metabolism increased. And that's why, like, back to, like, I think people oversimplify things, or they just don't grasp what we might mean if we say, like, you got to match the calories in, calories out. So say there was like that simple concept. There's the caveat of, are the calories that are going in or like from a source that's going to increase the metabolic rate or not? And a lot of times when people look at calories in versus out, the popular conceptions of that are, and the popular like applications of it are just people saying like, you can eat whatever the fuck you want, eat Pop-Tarts, but whatever. But that's not a long-term good thing, because what's going to happen is you're going to be decreasing your metabolic rate through the consumption of the wrong sources of those calories. I mean, the calorie itself is just a measurement of energy, but you
completely void of micronutrients too.
Yeah. I mean, most of these diets, it's like if it fits your macros or just the calorie type thing, it's a short-term concept. Like they're not really fully understanding the impact that the source of the food has on your hormones and on your metabolic rate.
Yeah.
So if you can intake though, if you can consume calories from sources like that, if you are consuming energy from sources of food that have the micronutrients in them that are going to increase your metabolic rate, then by increasing the metabolic rate, therefore you can consume more calories. That's like the truth about the whole thing. So that's where you really want to focus on. So the PEAT diet is interesting because it was the exact same diet that if you go back to the lab that came out with the essential fatty acid hypothesis back in the 30s.
Really?
That's where it came from.
Wow.
So that's why I was reading the study from that lab that the dude, the research assistant. So they were like, I don't know, I can't remember what that guy's name was. Shit. The main lab was like George something, but basically the dude who came up with the essential fatty acid hypothesis completely ignored and took money from, he ignored the real data. He took money from the main, I think it was actually Procter & Gamble back then. He took money from them to come out with this hypothesis that you need these certain fatty acids, these polyunsaturated fats, in order to survive, which is ridiculous. But if you actually look at the research that they were doing in the lab, it was really interesting because they were showing positive results by doing the opposite. They created this diet that was a complete elimination of polyunsaturated fats, essentially, if you just look at it in the simplest way. But the diet that they were feeding to the rodents that they then fed, that the research assistant documented himself doing, was literally the Ray Peat diet. It was high amounts of fruit juices, like good natural one, fresh squeeze, raw milk, shellfish, I think collagen, like they were consuming that, and then supplementing with these key minerals, these trace minerals. And I think B vitamins also. Yeah,
because the only reason that they could keep the mice from dying if they had enough, I think it was vitamin B6.
With the high PUFA.
Yeah, so whenever they were completely polyunsaturated deficient, they actually began to produce omega-9. And so whenever they produced omega-9, they would start dying off, and they found that they were I think it was B6 deficient. And so whenever they supplied enough vitamin B6, their metabolic rate would just keep increasing at that point, whenever they were completely PUFA deficient.
And the cool thing, I actually was talking to this manager for some heavy hitter, like NFL type people. I talked to him the other day. He's suffered from migraines his whole life, and that's why I thought of this study again too, because he was wondering if there's anything that could, like you see in every single specialist, that none of them could help, right? So not assuming I could help, but I'd seen this study from that lab in the 30s, and what the research assistant, it was just happened to be part of the whole story and the documented thing. He had suffered from migraines his entire life. He's 30-something years old. Within 2 weeks of consuming that diet, they all went away and never came back, which is crazy.
Yeah,
it's cool. It's really, really cool. So I told him, I was like, here's this, this is what happened. I told him the story, and then really the chief thing that they were doing was just not consuming polyunsaturated fats. And I think also in that study, the guy lost a bunch of body fat immediately.
Yeah, like I think he was obese, and he started losing weight like instantly.
Just melting off. Yeah. So if you want to look at just like a pure diet to increase metabolic rate, that's really it's highlighting really what the important things are. Getting that glucose, the fructose, the lactose from the raw milk. It really just sugar. That's these are all sugars.
Yeah.
And then having the right vitamins and minerals and amino acids present in the diet. And that's where really the concept of Thermo is to take that pure concept and translate it into a way of eating and living that is actually sustainable and enjoyable. Because really, I mean, it might be enjoyable for some people to do that, but it's not sustainable to just drink juice and milk and eat oysters. And it really isn't. Like, are you gonna do that for the rest of your life? No. Yeah. So focus on the main, like, real reason behind all that is really the highlight of the right amino acids, the right vitamins and minerals, and the right types of sugar in the diet. And that's what you can get through Thermo. Yeah. That's the idea.
And saturated fats.
And saturated fat. Actually, I think he was consuming coconut oil too. So, yeah. But there was just no polyunsaturated fats at all in the diet.
Yeah. It's really interesting. So, what's next?
I don't know. What else you think would be helpful to help people increase their metabolism? I think we probably covered most of it and just the key concepts of it. And you want to make sure that you're regulating your stress hormones. I think that's really important. I don't know. That's probably about covers it for me.
Yeah. So I would say the biggest things to take away from this conversation is eliminate polyunsaturated fats, stop eating your vegetables, eat plenty of sugar, and make sure that the quality of your food is good and supplies adequate nutrition.
Yeah. Meaning it has the right vitamins, minerals, and amino acids in the food. That's, as a caveat. I mean, because when we say like consuming sugar, you want to make sure the source of the sugar is also rich in the stuff that you want, right? It's a temporary thing to be like, you have some like gummy bears or something, right? But and that's what, I don't know. Unfortunately, people just hear sugar and they think the wrong things. They think like candy and all that,
or like cake and cupcakes, which actually have more PUFA than they do sugar
and anti-nutrients.
Yeah,
in the flours and that's
it's super high in iron.
Yeah, enriched in iron. So yeah, that's really the basis of it. I mean, if you want to increase your metabolism, just eat Thermo. Really, we did the work for everyone in terms of like coming up with breaking it down into this framework that works, like focusing on the right certain sources of the foods and sources of stress management, and how to do this stuff right. So Thermo really is the culmination of many years of researching and thinking and testing and developing a framework for doing it, and it will continue evolving. I mean, there are a lot of caveats. Sometimes people ask questions of like just very, very nuanced things, and it's like, that's a good question. Let's keep driving this forward and figuring out, building a richer map for what this is over the coming decade.
Yeah, and like if you have any counter evidence or questions, then please send them to us, because it just helps us gain a new perspective and look at it from a different angle.
Yeah, so hopefully that was a good way to increase your metabolism. If you are interested in hearing more of these episodes, maybe this is the first one you've heard, or maybe you've heard all of them, just you can subscribe in Apple, what do they even call it nowadays? I usually call it iTunes, but that was like the old school thing now.
Apple Podcasts.
Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Google Podcasts.
Spotify. It's on the Thermo Diet website, thermodiet.com.
YouTube also, we have it on YouTube.
Yeah.
So go to thermodiet.com though. So we have the new website up. It's really cool, if I do say so myself.
Yeah.
It's pretty sweet. And we have a very much more detailed thermo body type survey that's been built. So there are a lot of different outcomes that are very specific. It's going to teach you what your next steps should be within the course. So if you already have the course, basically it's, you just log in, do what the survey results say. If you don't have the course yet, then you can get it and apply the action items from the survey results. We have a big vision for building out the Thermo website over the coming years, and making it just a great resource for everyone that's down to go Thermo, ready to change their life. So subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a good review if you like it. We will see you on the next episode.